Good evening, and welcome to Wilson Hall Auditorium. Please take a moment to locate your nearest emergency exit, and at this time, please stop texting and turn off your cell phone. As mandated by federal copyright law, any form of unauthorized recording or photography is strictly prohibited. There will be no intermission. Thank you, and enjoy the event.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first installment of this year's Madison Vision Series. I'm Jon Alger, president of James Madison University. We are delighted to partner with the College of Arts and Letters and the Provost's Office for today's event, and a special thanks to Professor Inman Majors for his great work on the Writer's Hour series. Let me also offer a word of gratitude to the School of Liberal Arts Alumni Board for their generous gift to support the Grisham Writer's Hour. The Madison Vision Series provides an opportunity for our community to explore major public issues of our time. We hope to stimulate thought, discussion, and action with a variety of speakers, perspectives, and disciplines. Tonight, we're in for a very special treat. Jon Grisham joins us again for the Writer's Hour, where Mr. Grisham hosts conversations with distinguished authors about their writing process and what inspires them. This evening, Jon Grisham will be joined by acclaimed historian Jon Meacham. Now, by my count, that makes 3 guys named John that will be up here on stage tonight. So I'm thinking maybe we should form a new rock band. What do you think? After all, one of Mr. Meacham's recent books is about the songs of America. But I digress. Jon Grisham has sold over 300 million books worldwide, and his books have been translated into over 40 languages. 9 of his novels have been turned into feature films. Mr. Grisham has turned his experience as a former attorney into a wonderful tapestry of stories that millions of people have enjoyed. Now, we do have that in common, by the way. Both Mr. Grisham and I are recovering lawyers. Maybe Mr. Grisham's next book will be about the lawyer turned university president, so long as the president doesn't get killed, of course. But Jon Grisham is not merely a popular writer. He represents our belief at JMU that we need to be the change that we want to see in the world. He's devoted countless hours to charitable causes, including raising almost $9 million to support the Gulf Coast after Hurricane Katrina. Mr. Grisham also serves, as some of you may know, as his local Little League commissioner and has 6 baseball fields on his property that have played host to 26 teams and hundreds of children. Joining Jon Grisham on the stage tonight is Jon Meacham. Mr. Grisham will introduce Jon Meacham further, but I do want to take a moment to express my personal gratitude for this visit. Over the years, Jon Meacham has told the American story, giving us a glimpse into the ways this country has evolved. I especially appreciate Jon Meacham's ability to balance the strengths of our nation's leaders with their imperfections, and to remind us of the true spirit of the American ideal and the better angels of our nature. As we approach Constitution Day here in the U.S. once again, this is a perfect moment for us to reflect on who we are as a people and a society. May tonight be a reminder of the work we still need to do to embrace fully the meaning of we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. Please join me now in welcoming Jon Grisham to the stage. Jon, welcome back to James Madison University.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, President Alger. I'm delighted to be back on campus at JMU, especially in this beautiful, newly renovated Wilson Auditorium. Thank all y'all for coming. This is the third installment in the Grisham Writers Hour. I don't know how long it's going to go on. We tried to line up the speaker for next spring. We tried to line up the speaker for this fall, and nobody else would come, so that's how we got Jon Meacham. He's an old friend of mine. I'm supposed to introduce him and be polite. Jon Meacham is a presidential biographer who has written books about Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Bush Sr., FDR, and Churchill. He's also written about the Civil Rights Movement, the Founding Fathers, the Civil War, and other subjects. His current project is a book on James Madison, and he can't quite seem to get it finished. Last year, he took a detour and wrote a book called The Soul of America. And this year, he took a detour and wrote a book called The Songs of America. It's a weird book because it's written by a guy with absolutely no vocal or musical talent. I'll get him to explain it later. Jon Meacham was chosen by the Bush family to write the official biography of President George Herbert Walker Bush. He was later asked by the family to speak at his funeral, and a few months later, he was asked to deliver a eulogy at the service for Barbara Bush. When he's not doing funerals, he teaches. Used to teach at his alma mater, Sewanee. He's now on the faculty at Vanderbilt. He's a contributor to the New York Times Book Review, to Time Magazine, a former editor at Random House, the former editor-in-chief of Newsweek. He likes television and is often seen on Morning Joe and Bill Maher, other shows. These days, Jon Meacham is everywhere, and we are honored to have him here today at JMU. Please welcome my friend, Jon Meacham.
That was nicer than usual. Thank you.
You sit here.
That was much nicer than usual. Thank you.
We did something similar to this a year and a half ago in Charlottesville, and I had an introduction I thought was very witty and funny, and
It was just long, as I
had
recall.
a few insults.
It's longer than several of your novels.
It had too many insults, and at one point, halfway through my introduction, John came out from behind the podium behind me and sort of attacked me physically. And I was worried about, it kind of threw me off. I couldn't finish the introduction. So I scaled it back tonight.
It was impressive. It was impressive. So let me just jump right in. May I?
You're getting paid. Go ahead.
Yeah. The proceeds from this are like one afternoon at the Atlanta airport for Grisham and his sales. Trust me. Only at one of the places where you get the Dunkin' Donuts and then you get the book. It's great. It's perfect. So 11 years ago, I was at the National Book Festival on the Washington Mall. I was on my way at that point to give my talk about Andrew Jackson, and a woman runs up to me, which doesn't happen enough, or ever, actually. And she says, "Oh my God, it's you." I said, "Well, yeah, Existentially speaking, that's hard to argue with, I'm from Tennessee, so I have to leave the state to use existential as an adverb. She said, I've loved your books. They've meant so much to me and my family. Will you wait right here? I'm going to go buy your book and have you sign it. I said, yes, ma'am. I stood there thinking, this is the way the world is supposed to work. Women run up to you, they buy your book. It's a twofer. Hand to God, she brings back a copy of The Runaway Jury. So I signed the goddamn thing. Next day, it's a true story. Next day, I'm on my way. I worked on, is he still there? Yeah, I worked on that book for 17 years. It was supposed to be posthumous, but Bush would say, not gonna do it. Dana Carvey once said, the key to doing George Herbert Walker Bush's voice was Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne. Not gonna do it. So I'm at lunch with the Bushes in Maine, and for some reason, it was just the three of us, and that was very unusual because Bush World was like a WASP Epcot. right? I mean, Gorbachev would be playing horseshoes, the Oak Ridge Boys would be in the kitchen. It was a very strange universe. But it was just us. And I told this story about being mistaken for Grisham. And Barbara Bush looked across the table in that inimitable way of hers and said, well, how do you think poor John Grisham would feel? You know, he's a very handsome man. So it was a bad weekend. And yet, here I am.
All right, so here's my favorite Barbara Bush story. In 1991, The Firm was published and became a bestseller. And Mrs. Bush was leaving the White House one day to go hop on the helicopter. And she was photographed leaving the White House holding under her arm a copy of the green book, The Firm, and it was a nice picture. And somebody sent it to me, so I sent her an autographed copy of The Firm. Thank you, I hope you enjoyed the book. She sent me a copy of her book she had just published about her beagles or something. She had dogs or something.
Millie.
Spring. And so we started this pen pal thing, back a few times, back and forth.
Yep.
And then we were living in Oxford, Mississippi at the time, and one day in the mail, my wife and I got this really fancy gold embossed invitation to a formal White House dinner. And we were stunned. A couple of kids from the suburbs, we weren't expecting this. Everything was new back then. It was a very exciting time. But it was an official state dinner. And so Renee she did her research, and we started spending money on clothes and black tie and all this kind of stuff. And so Renee said, oh, there's only 150 people at each dinner. That's the maximum capacity in the red, green room, whatever.
It's called the East Room.
Whatever, I haven't been there as much as you have, obviously.
Yeah. This is why you write fiction.
And she said, anyway, here we go. Anyway, back on the course here. So Renee said seating is crucial. Where you seat is they have these round tables, 15 round tables of 10. They're going to stick us way back in the corner. I said, I don't care. We're there. So we go to the White House, and we're going through the line, and we go into the reception area for a glass of champagne, and I turn around, and there's Gregory Peck.
Ooh. That's high cotton.
And I said, there's Atticus Finch. And she said, Renee, can we go talk to Gregory Peck? She said, no, you can't talk to these people. So I didn't talk to him. I didn't talk to one of my literary heroes, Atticus Finch. Anyway, we got into the big room, and we got a little tag, your table number, and sure enough, Renee was stuck way off in the back, and I was seated next to Barbara Bush. And we sat there for 3 hours, and she trashed everybody else in the room. We had more fun talking. It was not ugly, but she had something to say about it.
Oh, she could be.
She could be funny and cutting and not vulgar, but off color at times. She was hilarious.
She was the best. She was absolutely
we
the best.
became good buddies after that, and I did her literacy event in Houston a couple times. One of my fondest memories was after they were out of office in the mid-1990s. She threw a big literacy event, still does, and still did in Houston, and invited all these big writers to come in and raise a bunch of money. Houston Society. And so afterwards, I was having dinner. After dinner, we were having drinks, and I sat with Big George, for about 30 minutes, drinking a Heineken, talking baseball.
Yeah.
No politics, no nothing. He played at Yale. He loved baseball, and that was one of my fondest memories of those two. They were wonderful people.
I miss them. We lost Mrs. Bush last April, and the president, obviously, late last year. And it's funny. I had this experience, and I hope we all do at some point. After the afternoon of Mrs. Bush's funeral, which was in Houston, my wife and I were hustling back to get to the father-daughter dance in Nashville, and there'd been just enough number of outrages. Clinton had done something, Marilyn Quayle had done something. It was just, it was like C-SPAN hijinks, And the one person I wanted to tell was Mrs. Bush. And I actually thought, you know what, I think I'll just send an email. I went, oh my God, no, she's dead. But she was that kind of wonderful, wonderful person, and called him as she saw him, and she allowed me to read her diary, which she had kept from 1948 until she died. And actually, when I told Doro, their youngest child, that I was reading the diary, she said, "Oh God, don't tell me," and did this. A great American family.
So we're supposed to talk about books.
Books, they read books, yeah.
Your last book, The Songs of America,
Yeah,
you collaborated with Tim McGraw
I did.
so you could meet Faith.
Totally. Totally.
I got to
You
ask
got
you,
it.
why would you be attracted to a book like that?
Why would I be attracted to Faith?
No, to a book.
Oh.
Describe the book, okay?
Right. So the book,
Virtually no one's read it, so go and describe the book, all right?
you know, Matthew McConaughey's going to be in the movie, asshole. I borrowed that from when George W. Bush was governor. Went down to Texas. I went down because I'm from Tennessee, and I said, just casually, I said, Governor, if it weren't for us, y'all'd still be part of Spain. And he went, "That's pretty funny, asshole." So that was an affectionate remark. Now, I wrote a book last May, 2 Mays ago, called The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. The president said something very kind about it, unlike my other host. And it was about the fact that every era of American life is shaped by the struggle between our worst instincts and our better angels. And that if we get to 51% of the better angels winning, that's a hell of a good era. And perfection can't be the goal, more perfection has to be. And the message is really important to me for obvious reasons. And Tim is a neighbor and a friend, and we were sitting around at Christmas last year, actually. And he asked me, had I ever thought about the role music played in different eras I'd written about? And honestly, I hadn't, because I'm not allowed to sing in church even. I mean, it's just not allowed. Not long ago, I tried to sing something on the radio in the car, and my 15-year-old daughter said, "Daddy, it's not that you don't have talent, it's as if God reached down and affirmatively took it away." And I was so proud of her for using affirmatively in that sense that I wasn't insulted. And so what we wanted to do was try to figure out to what extent was music a mirror or a maker of the manners and politics of a given era. And it almost always turned out to be that way. The 1980s in some ways can be talked about as the tension between Born in the USA and God Bless the USA, right? Two different, red versus blue, even though we didn't use those terms then. Woody Guthrie wrote "This Land Is Your Land" in direct response to Irving Berlin's God Bless America. He heard it, he didn't like it, he wanted a different view. The Depression can be understood as the optimism of Happy Days Are Here Again and the pessimism of Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? And so it goes all the way back. Dixie and Battle Hymn of the Republic. And it was really an excuse to actually go on the road a little bit, and we did a series of shows, basically, where I would talk and Tim would sing. And we were just trying to carry this message that history's complicated. If you think it's never been worse, that just means you don't know enough about what came before.
Is it fair to ask about your Madison book, the one you can't finish?
Sure. It's a little harsh,
You keep taking these detours in the middle. You got this big Madison. We met, 3 or 4 years ago at Montpelier. You spoke that night.
Yeah.
Told some of the same stories we'll hear tonight.
Yeah.
And then you were talking about your Madison book.
Yeah.
Was you were working hard on it. And you published 2 books since then.
Yeah.
What's the problem?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, you write more books than most people write checks. So that's a little unkind of you.
You don't see my wife's shop. Check writing and book writing.
Yeah, you can tell she's not here. That's the only way he's got away with that. No, it's terrific. I'm doing James and Dolly because Dolly Madison was arguably the most important American woman of the first 30 years of the Republic. Certainly the most important woman in public life. In many ways created the infrastructure of Republican government, lowercase r. She was the ranking woman in Washington from 1801 until they left in 1817 because Jefferson's wife, of course, had died. So, and Madison was Secretary of State, as you all know. So it's a big book, and honestly, the reason I broke off the first time was because of what happened in your hometown in Charlottesville in August of 17. because of the violence at the neo-Nazi rally, it occurred to me that we needed some sense of proportion about how to rank this moment in the relative sweep of American history.
So let's talk about that book, The Soul of America. In it, you write about the darkest chapters in American history. You
Yep.
write about the end of the Civil War, Lincoln's assassination, Reconstruction, the rise of the Klan, the rise of Jim Crow. You write about the Great Depression, the Second War. You write about the resurgence of the Klan. You write about the missile crisis. You write about the assassination. Those were times of great fear. I mean, did you write the book to sort of put things in perspective, to tell us that, you know, as fearful as things are today, we've been through worse?
Yes. At least we think it was worse. It's still unfolding, right? I think we make a mistake when we think that the past somehow was simpler and easier than our own time. Look, if you voted for the incumbent president, you're probably not here, but just guessing. If you voted for the incumbent president, you were voting because you believed that the country was headed in an irrevocable direction of decline. If you voted against the incumbent, you've probably set your hair on fire 3 times today, right? So my goal was to try to figure out, where does this fit? And I think that one of the utilities of history is not as a GPS. It's not, you can't just say exactly how do we do this and we're going to do it again. But I think it is a diagnostic guide. There are certain symptoms that recur that lead to a diagnosis that might lead to a course of treatment. And my own view is that if we don't realize that every era has been a struggle, we foreclose the possibility of learning from the past, and we don't do proper honor to the people who fought and died to get us here. John Lewis has never said that this is the worst things have ever been, right? So this is not Mr. Rogers and Zoloft, I promise. It's not, we're definitely going to get through it. But it is to understand that 100 years ago, this is Wilson Auditorium, right? Is this Woodrow Wilson?
Right.
Okay, sorry, but we're going to talk for a second about what happened. So 100 years ago, if we'd been here 101 years ago in 1918, we would be in the midst of the First World War, heading toward the end in about a month. Wilson resegregated the federal government. He closed down 400 newspapers and magazines with which he disagreed. He launched, through his Attorney General, Mitchell Palmer, who makes Bill Barr look like Oliver Wendell Holmes, launches warrantless raids on suspected dissidents. On 1915, on the Saturday after Thanksgiving, the Ku Klux Klan was refounded at Stone Mountain, Georgia. The flames from that cross went across America. 2 to 6 million Americans joined the KKK 100 years ago. There were 6 United States senators who were members of the Klan, 30 members of the House. The governors of Georgia and Texas were members of the Klan. That might not be all that surprising given our history. But also the governors of Indiana, Colorado, and Oregon were members of the KKK 100 years ago. And as I get older, 100 years ago seems a lot less time. And so what does that tell us? It tells us that the battle between those worst instincts and those better angels is perennial. And we have to figure out, how did all of this take place in the early 1920s, and yet by 1933, 34, there was a coherent American story again. It happened because of leadership. It happened because of Franklin Roosevelt. It happened because enough Americans decided that those forces that were flowing in about 1920 or so needed to ebb. They won't ever be totally defeated. If you defeat the incumbent president today, the kingdom of God is not going to arrive the next day. It's just not. We live in a fallen, frail, and fallible world. And if we don't get to 51%, then it's an era not worth emulating and not worth commemorating. So my view is that if you understand that this is a perennial struggle, you are more likely to take part in that struggle than to throw up your hands and just say, oh, everything's a disaster.
You say, and I quote, fear is about limits, hope is about growth. Do you see any grassroots movements that are inspired by hope today?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the broadly put, the resistance, you've got more than half the country that doesn't want to be moving in this direction. You know, the incumbent is the president because of an 18th century model that we can argue about, but which has by and large produced good results. I think a lot of folks think it is not a great result right now. But I would feel differently if he'd won the popular vote. I think that if you look at, we met with some students not long ago, you got some fabulous students, they were great questions. Grisham's answers were a little subpar, but it was okay. And those folks are the ones who are coming of age having two presidential eras in their minds, Barack Obama and Donald Trump. That's a pretty big country that can produce, imagine this, Barack Obama was president of the United States at noon, and Donald Trump was president at 12:01. This is a weird country, right? And we do tend to bounce from guardrail to guardrail. Can you imagine, this sounds like the Star Wars bar scene in C-SPAN, what I'm about to say. Can you imagine a more different set of people than George H.W. Bush to Bill Clinton? Bill Clinton to George W. Bush. I didn't think I'd live to see a sharper contrast than George W. Bush and Barack Obama until, so that means we may get Aristotle next time.
Okay, the student, by the way, if we get bored here, we may just open it up for questions. So if you have a question, sit on it, and we love to take questions from the floor. It takes the pressure off us. We're not that prepared. So I like to, lean on the audience to help us out occasionally. The students are really keen to know, they ask both of us this question about the writing process.
Right.
And we have very, very different, it's fiction versus nonfiction, different processes. But tell us how you go, okay, this is the question I had for you. How do you go about picking a subject, Madison, when there have been 1,000 books written about Madison?
How many of those have you read? Okay, there we go. I say that all.
I can't remember a single one.
There you go. That may be true in 2 years too.
You assume I'm going to read yours.
No, I'm not assuming. I just said you won't. No, I think that first of all, I want to write about big things because I think big things are important. You never have to explain, except for that question, why you're writing about an American president, because an American president has a diffuse and discernible impact on almost all aspects of American life. So I have 3 tests I look at before I embark on something. One is, can I find an angle of vision on even the most familiar of stories that I believe is original? Secondly, can that angle of vision actually shed light on what's happening for us now? I think that's incredibly important. And third, is there some documentary record, is there some research work that can be put into the vernacular that's not there now that can help explain and answer that question? And when I think I've got all 3 of those boxes checked, I do it. It also has to be a great story. And one of my goals in biography is to, and with all respect to your namesake, I can imagine for almost all the founders, for Jefferson, for Washington, for Franklin, for Adams, we can pretty much imagine what it would be like if they came and sat down at our dinner table, right? You'd probably say, why are you here? But you can see that. Madison, less so. And James Madison is seen as this scholarly, retiring guy, seen as not a particularly good president. That's mainly because of Henry Adams. But even being a two-term president, even in the early 19th century, was not a job for someone who was uncharismatic. That didn't happen. So there was a political skill, there was a political power in this little guy that I want to try to bring out and explain. And if I can finish this project and you can read it and you can imagine what it would be like after you close it to have him come by for a cup of coffee, then my work is done. And is there anything more important than understanding the Constitution and the development of the separation of powers and the beginnings of American national greatness? Is there anything more important to understand at this particular moment? Madison was someone who governed from the presidency, understanding that there were inherent and wise limits on presidential power. How common is that right now? I'm not sure, right? So now the thing about Madison is he didn't do a lot in 140 characters, so that's tricky, but we're trying.
You make it look seamless. Am I on? Yeah. You make it look seamless. You go between political science and history and back and forth. I mean, I know they're so interrelated. Do you prefer one over the other?
I absolutely prefer history. I think that political science is an attempt, by and large, to render something inexplicable explicable. History is political scientist. It's fascinating, and I love drawing on the data, but history is about people. A republic is about people. Here's an uncomfortable truth. Politicians are far more often mirrors of who we are rather than makers. It's not as though somehow or another our politics, if we say our politics is broken, we are implicitly saying that a significant part of the country itself is broken. That's the nature of popular government. And that's why I think our dispositions of heart and mind matter enormously. We understandably talk a lot about leadership. We write a lot about leadership. But followership and citizenship are just as important in the calculus of power and free government. And there is still something, for all of our unhappiness right now, there is still something here worth preserving and perpetuating. What is our immigration issue in this country? Our immigration issue is that people want to come here. We can debate the rest of the month about how we're treating those folks when they come to the border or come across the border, but they still believe that they have more hope here than where they're coming from. And 30 years ago, Wednesday, January 11th, 1989, one of the most important farewell addresses ever given by an American president, Ronald Reagan said, "We always have to be a home for all the pilgrims from all the lost places who are hurtling through the darkness toward home." We had to be that shining city on a hill. Whatever you might think about Ronald Reagan in sum, that was a vision of the country. That was a story about the country that was about widening our arms and opening ourselves, not closing it. And I never knew President Reagan. It's one of my great regrets. But I did get to know Mrs. Reagan. Whew.
Is that good or bad?
Well, if you were Ronnie, it was good. So she was just tough woman. And Jimmy Stewart said if Reagan had married her the first time, he would have won an Academy Award. And so, Reagan is the only man I know who actually improved on Scripture. So his great phrase, right, was shining city on a hill.
Right.
From, you're a Southern Baptist, you know this. It's from the Sermon on the Mount that we should be as a city upon a hill. Reagan added the word shining and sort of riffed it off John Winthrop, but it was still Reagan who added shining. And it was so powerful. I'm not making this up, I have heard ministers say from the pulpit that, as Jesus said, America shall be as a shining city upon a hill. So I knew Mrs. Reagan a little bit, so I went out to have lunch with her in Bel Air once, and I had just heard a preacher say this, no kidding. And I was she always knew more gossip than I did, which was really annoying because she was 92 and living out there. And so I said, well, you know, ma'am, it's amazing. You know, President Reagan improved on Jesus. And she said, oh, yes, that's the kind of thing Ronnie did. May we all someday be loved as Nancy Davis loved Ronald Reagan. But that's the vision, that's the hope. And that may sound like a homily, it may sound like a 4th of July thing, but it's not. It's historically based. Think about an era you would like to go back to. And I promise you, that will be an era where we more generously applied that Jeffersonian sentence that has changed more lives around the world than any other. That we are all created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. And I know it didn't include everyone. It still doesn't, but it includes more people today than it did then. It has inspired more people than almost any other sentence originally rendered in English. Most important sentence in English, I would argue. And drive through Washington. Who do we build monuments to? George Washington, the Sacred Fire of Liberty, Thomas Jefferson. Is there anything more American than the fact that Martin Luther King and Thomas Jefferson now stare at each other across the tidal basin? It's brilliant. It's wonderful.
Just leave your hat on for being a political scientist, okay?
All right.
And you don't have to take sides here, but predict. Play out the next 14 months.
Look,
We can all do that, okay? But you're the expert, John.
Yeah, here's how much of an expert I am. Until 1:30 on election night last time, I kept thinking, no, this isn't going to happen. So take it for what it's worth. I think Vice President, they're getting ready to talk, aren't they? It's very kind of you all to come because there's a debate going on, or about to. I think Vice President Biden, right now, if I were betting, I would think he would be the nominee, and I think he would win. I think that it will be a difficult road for him because Biden represents a kind of emergency surgery. It's kind of, he's an oxygen tank for the country, really. And Senator Warren and the other candidates are more of a jolt. My gut, and again, I live in Tennessee, so when I say I have conservative friends, that's redundant. My gut is that Trump would beat Senator Warren, but I know the polls don't show that, so I don't really have much evidence for it. I have a friend who was the chairman of the Tennessee Democratic Party, which is like being the radar operator of Pearl Harbor, right? Who said, can you imagine a worse job? Awful. What's second prize? He said that we're basically in a fight between two visions of the past. Trump wants to take us back to 1955, and Biden wants to take us to 1965. It's a really good point. But as one of your students pointed out to us today, elections are about the future. And so that's a huge part of the tension. But when you're in a world where Donald Trump is president, none of these rules, none of these buoys really make much sense.
All right, you mentioned the top three.
Yeah.
In the next tier, do you see somebody who has potential to break out?
I think they're formidable political talents. I think Senator Harris, Senator Booker, Mayor Buttigieg, I think they're all really interesting candidates. Castro is interesting. I think it's interesting that we're in about the 9th or 10th month of where that field has been, and there's been so little movement. That said, that man right there was, as he would put it, an asterisk heading into Iowa in 1980, and he beat Reagan. At this point in 2007, the two people in the lead positions in both parties, one was Rudy Giuliani and the other was Hillary Clinton. Neither got the nomination. So these things can turn fairly quickly. My own sense is that the election will come down to, can hope, which any Democratic candidate is going to have to argue, overcome what will be a fearful ferocious knife fight from the incumbent.
Well, how can it get any worse, though? I mean, you know that's
Don't
going to happen.
ask that.
You know that's going to happen. I mean, seriously.
Don't ask that.
I mean, we're almost sort of just jaded or calloused by his daily activities. And what else? What crazy thing can he do today that's going to turn his base off? Really, I mean, we're immune.
He hasn't used the nukes yet, but that's about it. No, I think it's. Look, I'm not trying to be reflexively partisan in any way. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I voted for both. I plan to continue to. But I don't. If you look at, there is a certain method to the madness sometimes. And he has shown no interest, much to my surprise, actually. He has shown no interest in growing his level of support. He simply wants to keep the people who are with him. And so everything is designed to keep those people in place and energize them. This is not about a swing voter. This old myth we have of there are 6 people in Ohio, if you could get them, you win. Right? That's just gone. But there are also people, and I want to meet them, who voted for Barack Obama twice and Donald Trump once. There are a lot of those folks. And what's the message there? The message is, let's blow things up. And so the issue is going to be, will they get tired of this show? Because that's what it is. I mean, and the president said this. He said during the transition that he wanted to treat every day of the presidency as if it were an episode of a TV show in which he vanquishes his rivals. He said that. So he's running this as a reality TV show. The difference is this is actually our reality.
Okay, let me play the devil's advocate from the other side of the street. A strong case can be made that we're in pretty good shape. Look at the economy. Unemployment is very low. Stock market is still setting records. The recent tax cuts have put a lot of money in the pockets of a lot of people. We're not involved in a major war. We have not had yesterday was 9/11, we've not had a major terrorist attack in 18 years. You can argue that more Americans have health insurance today. So things are pretty good.
Things are pretty good if you're on the right side of the equation. If you're on the wrong side of the equation, they're not getting better. And there's an opportunity cost, no matter what you think about what you should do in terms of social mobility into a sustainable middle-class life. There's an opportunity cost that we have not addressed climate. There's an opportunity cost in our chaotic foreign policy, particularly involving both the trade war with China and the odd relationship with Russia. I have a theory about all this, that in some ways you can look at American history from 1933 to 2017 as a figurative conversation between Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan. That we had, think about it for a second, we had debates about the relative role of the government in the economy and the relative projection of force against commonly agreed upon foes and rivals. And that was a field on which presidents of both parties played. I ran this by Obama, he agrees, so I have that seal of approval. He was dealing with tax rates. He was dealing with how to cover people within an existing system. There was a coherent conversation, as ferocious as the disputes of the different eras were. This is not a sequential chapter to that conversation. You have a party that used to be about free trade, the free flow of people, the free flow of ideas, that is no longer about any of those three things. You have this odd relationship with a geopolitical rival for whom the President of the United States explicitly sides with their analysis of both their interference in our domestic politics and their geopolitical ambitions, as opposed to our own intelligence agencies. So it's an odd moment. I understand what you're saying about the market. I understand what you're saying about the economy, the unemployment rate. But the social science, the polling shows that most people are still unhappy with the overall drift of the country. And I think that's because they are terrified, understandably, that we don't have a coherent answer to globalization and its implications. And eras like this, that's the reason Trump is president. Trump is president because enough white working class folks thought that they didn't have a clear path to the middle class, and they chose to believe that that path was being blocked by other people. And they were not the same color as they were.
Well, okay, he also got elected because, can you hear me? Nope. I can't hear myself.
I can hear you.
You're all that matters, John.
That's what I like to say. He got elected because?
Because 3 million Democrats stayed at home.
Yeah.
Okay.
Presidential elections are not referenda, they're choices.
And so don't you think Trump has united Democrats like no one ever before?
Yes, and he loves that
Can you
phrase.
imagine a Democrat not voting next year? The ones I know can't wait to go vote.
Yeah.
I know you straddle the fence, but I'm a Democrat, all right?
Yeah.
And most of my friends, most of them are not Democrats, but most Democrats I know can't wait to go vote.
Right.
And take somebody with you.
Sure.
So if you have, Obama got 68 million votes and Hillary got 63, is that right, 60?
Yeah, she got more.
65, 66, yeah.
I think
She got 3 million more than Trump. But if the Democrats had voted, she would have won.
Well, in the right states.
The right states. But okay, let's talk about those states. Can you see Trump carrying Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin again? He won them by only 80,000 votes total to be elected.
I can't, but I didn't think he'd do it the first time. So I don't. I can't Carmack this. I think that we are in the political equivalent of climate change. It is extreme weather. It's 100 degrees today. It's going to be 60 degrees by the weekend. And it's the result of a lack of faith in our institutions to address the problems at hand. And therefore, we've become addicted to this idea that we'll throw one bum out and bring one in. I think it's a very unstable political environment. Richard Nixon used to say, and he knew more about running for president than anybody, he used to say that running for president was like running for governor of Ohio. Because if you carried Ohio, you were going to win. It's different now. It's different. And we're in this particularly partisan world where you don't think and then decide. You decide and then you think. Yeah. You pick a team, and that's the jersey you wear. And this is not an entirely new phenomenon. Walter Lippmann said in 1921 that one of the problems of the modern age was going to be that instead of seeing and then defining, we would define and then see. And that's one definition of political tribalism. And so it does become, as you're saying, this turnout war. Yeah. And I didn't think it would happen the first time.
Can we talk about books?
I love books. Even yours.
Is there one? That was a real cheap shot. Is there one historical figure that you still want to write about?
Oh, yeah, there are lots of folks. I want to write about Eisenhower, whom I think is fascinating. I think he was a critical figure in building this consensus we were talking about. I'd love to write about President Reagan. I think he, as President Obama pointed out, very few leaders really define an entire age, and both of those leaders did.
You write about presidents. Have you thought about writing fiction about like events? Or is it all
fiction or nonfiction?
I mean nonfiction. Is it all people or?
Well, I find people. I'm better at people than events. I may not be very good at people, but at least I'm better than that. There are lots, as you know, there are a ton of things that float by and you think would be a great book. I've always thought there'd be a great narrative, and it's one of my obsessions. What would we have done in December of 1941 if Hitler had not declared war on us on Thursday, December 11th. We didn't declare war on Germany until Germany declared war on us. Roosevelt didn't declare war in the great speech after Pearl Harbor on Germany. He declared it on Japan because they'd attacked us. Hitler made three great mistakes. Take one away of any of these three and the fate might have been different. He shouldn't have let the British Army escape from Dunkirk. He shouldn't have invaded the Soviet Union when he did. And he shouldn't have declared war unilaterally on the United States. And I've always been interested in climbing inside those 5 days about what Roosevelt was thinking, what Hitler was thinking, what Churchill was thinking about that particular moment, because the counterfactual is chilling.
I love the books of David McCullough. He's my second favorite historical writer after you.
And Michael Beschloss is your first?
No, he's third.
Oh.
He's very good. But I love the way David picks his topics, you know, the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah.
The Jonestown flood, the Wright brothers. He likes to do events, not necessarily people. He does both very well.
Yeah.
But I love to read his historical accounts of real events.
David has a great line that he was very much influenced by Thornton Wilder, the playwright, and 2 years before The Mast was his favorite book as a kid. His view is, if you're thinking about a book, you try to think of a book you would want to read that you can't find, and then go write it. And that's a terrific test.
Yeah. You mentioned Charlottesville. In August of 17, I lived there, and we were absolutely ambushed by what happened.
Yeah.
Because one reason people like to live there is because it is a very tolerant, open university town, and I've never met a skinhead, a Nazi, or a white supremacist in Oxford. They're not there. In Charlottesville. What happened though was we were targeted by these people who they've been wanting to fight for a long time.
Yeah.
And there are two sides. Two different groups who really want to fight. You've got the white nationalists and skinheads and all that. You have some pretty tough folks on the left, who the anti-fascists and those folks, and they've been clamoring for a good street brawl for a long time. And for some reason, they picked Charlottesville because of the monuments, because of all the controversy. But we were absolutely stunned by what happened. I have friends who were beaten. I know a lot of my friends that have an office downtown were witness fights. The police were not that active that day, and so it was a horrible time for us. We happened to be out of town on vacation. We watched it on television with horror, and we came back home. And walking through downtown Charlottesville the following Monday, we were determined to do it, to go check our friends, the restaurants, cafes, coffee shops, and just to be there for them. And a lot of people in town did that. And by then, all the bad guys were gone. But how that inspired you to write The Soul of America?
It did. I got a call that Sunday from the editor of Time magazine, a great woman named Nancy Gibbs, who wanted basically a history of American hate. And so I wrote about Reconstruction, the founding of the first Klan, the second Klan that we just talked about, the isolationist forces in the 1930s, obviously the pushback against integration, and it stuck with me. And about 2 months later, I decided to expand it into the book.
So you can write a book quickly.
I can. It may not be good, but I can. And I wrote it to, it was a message. And the message is, we have been here before.
Right.
And we're stronger when we're more open. And the fact that even sounds partisan is a sign of how skewed the moment is.
You gave the numbers about the Klan back in the 1920s. They're pretty shocking stuff. Do you think there are more hate groups now?
Absolutely.
The number's increasing.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of it is a reaction to President Obama. Remember how the incumbent president came to political prominence this time, right? Accusing the then incumbent president of the United States of not having been born in this country, with no evidence, and continued to say so even after the birth certificate was produced. So you don't have, it doesn't take Woodward and Bernstein to figure out what's going on here. And with all respect to Woodward and Bernstein. So my view of this is I can be a romantic about the presidency. I can be a romantic about the country because I love this country. I have one of the greatest lives I could possibly imagine because I was born here. Now, I am fully aware, too, that I speak from a place of great privilege. I am a boringly heterosexual, white, Southern Christian man, right? I have been given immense privileges. I was privately educated from the age of 4. I went to an Episcopal Montessori, which is redundant. A nominally Presbyterian high school that managed to produce both Ted Turner and Pat Robertson. We've got the whole thing covered. And Sewanee, the University of the South, which you all may not know it well, but it's best understood as a combination of Downton Abbey and Deliverance, both put together. So I got to take advantage of this moment, so I'm just going to keep going. This is like, remember when Ford debated Carter and the sound went out? Remember that? This is like that.
Testing one.
So I know I speak from privilege. But my view is if people like me don't talk about a progressive interpretation of the American story, then people who look like me who might disagree might not listen as much. So I'm a big believer that to whom much is given, much is expected. And I firmly hold, historically, that we are stronger when we apply that sentence more generously. Now, I called it the most important sentence ever written in the English language, and I'm aware that is hyperbolic. And I'm also careful because there's an old story about a Texas school board candidate who was against teaching Spanish in the public schools and said on the stump one day, if English was good enough for our Lord Jesus Christ, it's good enough for Texas. So I'm aware that this is probably
The King James Version.
the King James, yeah, with a drawl, yeah. Y'all, in red letters.
Wow.
So I'm aware of that. But this is not a Democratic uppercase D case. It is a lowercase d case, Democratic. It is about what Jefferson called the great ball of liberty would roll around the nation and then around the world. And it's also not a case, if I may, just the moderate way is not always the right way. I'm not arguing for a Brookings Institution interpretation of the world. The middle way wasn't the right way on American independence. 30% of the country was loyal to Great Britain. The middle way was not the right way on slavery. The middle way was not the right way on Hitler. The middle way, I'd argue, was not the right way on the Cold War. It's opposing Soviet tyranny. The middle way was not the right way on segregation. But those are 5 or 6 examples of existential crises. A lot of other things do lend themselves to listening. And I believe this as fervently as I believe anything. We are not being true to the American Revolution and the central insight both of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson and others, which was that reason had to have a chance to take a stand against passion in the arena, and that without reason, we would descend into monarchy and aristocracy, because then the will to power, as it would later be called, would become the central organizing principle, as opposed to our capacity to deal with conflicting data, manufacture a consensus to address a certain set of problems for a given period of time, which is the work of politics. Reinhold Niebuhr said, the sad duty of politics is to establish justice in a sinful world. And we can only do it for a little while, and then we have to do it again and again and again. Without reason, without the ability to change our minds, then we're in trouble. And I'm going to ask you in a second about when you've changed your mind. my view is if I get up, and I'm not being Pollyannish about this, if you're on that side of the aisle and I'm on this side, and you get up to give a speech, and before you even say anything, I have composed my tweet saying, there he goes again, he's a socialist, or whatever, and send it off. I'm not being true to the revolution. Now, if you get up and you talk, and I'll hear you out, and I go, Jesus, he's still a socialist, that's okay. Partisanship is the oxygen of free government. That's okay. But I bet at least one time out of 50, I might actually listen to you and think, maybe he has a point. And I'd submit to you that the best of America happens when you think, maybe he has a point.
So when was the last time the partisanship was this bad? We were so divided.
I would say the isolationism versus the interventionism of the late 1930s, early 1940s. The war. Arthur Schlesinger used to say that there was more ferocity, more vitriol over what to do about Hitler than even about Vietnam. And it was solved for us by external forces, by Japan and by Germany's unilateral declaration. So it's not as though we woke up one morning and said, yeah, I think we are going to defeat tyranny and project liberty. We were dragged into it.
I think you said a while ago, what was the percentage of people in 1939 who were isolationists, who wanted to stay out?
82% in 1939, according to Gallup, 82% of Americans did not want to sell arms to anybody, including France and England.
England? Including England?
Including England. It was a ferocious fight to get the destroyers for bases deal in September of 1940, and Lend-Lease was close in March of 41.
Bill Clinton tells a story about the frustration of being the president. When he was elected governor of Arkansas, he wanted to build a dam in some rural area that he was familiar with. He'd promised the voters a dam, and it needed to be built. So he got his officials together and the interior department, whatever, all these people in his office, and said, he's a rookie governor, I want this dam built. So a year later, nothing had happened. So he gets them back in his office, and I want this thing built, okay? So his first two-year term goes by, he gets reelected. This goes on, I think, for 16 years when he was governor.
He was governor.
Reagan beat him in 80, and he came back and won again.
In 82.
And back then you could serve forever in Arkansas, I think, 2 years.
Yeah, it was 2-year terms, you served forever. Yeah.
So he left office, the dam was never built. He got elected president in 1992. He said, okay, I'm going to show you now. So he goes to the White House. He gets all the big shots to come in, Department of Interior, Army Corps of Engineers, all these people. I want this dam built in this rural county of Arkansas, and I want it built now. I'm tired of it, okay? Well, a year goes by and nothing happens, okay? He gets them again. It's just a small dam. It's not even any money. Nothing happens. First term goes by. He can't get the dam built. Long story, 8 years go by. He leaves office. The dam has not been built, okay? And he says, you think I have power as the president? I could get a dam built in rural Arkansas. My question, you've studied the presidency, your whole career. Is it too much for one man or one woman, one person?
No, it's not. It's not. There's a big debate about this. And there's a big debate usually in moments of anxiety. The Carter years was the last time we had this conversation. There were op-eds, there were books. Globalism had made the job too complicated. The 18th century system of checks and balances was not commensurate with the challenges of global governance. I think if you get the right, and that surprises me about Bill Clinton, because Clinton I would have thought could have done that. But you get the right people, character is destiny. I think that the presidency itself, which we sometimes, we exaggerate its influence sometimes. Presidents are not like Fortinbras. They don't descend in Act 5 and just fix everything. Change in America comes when the work of the powerless intersects with the interests of the powerful. Lyndon Johnson could do what he did on civil rights because of what Rosa Parks and King and Lewis and countless other people whose names we'll never know, what they did. Right. And so I don't think it's too big a job. And the next person, no matter who it is or which party, or whether it's in 2 years or 6 years, is going to have an interesting task. Because I'll tell you this, we know that the presidency has not changed Donald Trump. What we don't yet know is to what extent he's changed the presidency itself. Let me ask you about, you talked earlier today about changing your mind on some stuff in the face of data and contrary experience. Tell the folks about it.
Which story was that? I tell so many stories.
The death penalty.
The what?
Death penalty.
Oh, the death penalty. We were talking to the students earlier, and a great question from one of the students about when I write about civil justice reform and criminal justice reform, and I write about the issues that I care about, death penalty and wrongful convictions and mass incarceration, all these problems we have with the criminal justice system that I enjoy writing about and write about more and more, have I found myself changing my ideals or thoughts or beliefs as I continue to write. And I gave two examples. The first and most dramatic happened to me in 1994, after 3 or 4 books were out, after some of the movies were out, and I was on death row in Mississippi, researching a book called The Chamber that takes place on death row. And I'd been there several times. I'd talked to the inmates, I'd talked to the guards, the jailers, I talked to the executioner who showed me how he mixed up his brew. It's an old-fashioned gas chamber before lethal injection. And so I'd been kind of a regular around death row, which is not something I ever want to do again. But I had to for the book. And one day I was in the execution room, which is next to the death room where the gas chamber is located. And the condemned man spends his last hour in this room by himself with nobody but a chaplain, if he wants a chaplain. And so I was there with the prison chaplain. We were sitting on bunks. The room is tiny, and it's dank and smells bad, and it's dark, and 5 feet away was the gas chamber through the door, and we were having a moment. It was very, very moving. And he was a retired Baptist preacher, and he said he worked on death row for a long time and ministered to the men and loved them and tried to help them in spite of what they had done. And he said, "Mr. Grisham, are you a Christian?" And I said, "I am." He said, "Okay, I'm going to ask you a question. Do you think Jesus condones what we do here?" And I said, "No, there's no way." He said, "You're right. This is not right." At that moment, I flipped completely on the death penalty. I'd grown up in a Southern Baptist world, where it's eye for an eye and all that kind of stuff, and I flipped. Even as a young criminal defense lawyer for 10 years, I never had someone facing the death penalty, but I'd never really stopped to think about it. And that was one moment when I stopped and I thought about it, and I changed my mind.
I think that's absolutely essential for all of us. And not on that specific issue, but if we don't have the capacity to rethink things, then we're not using our reason, and we're turning the world into this perpetual Hobbesian struggle, where, to shift metaphors, it's just the Thunderdome, right? We're all just banging against each other. And we've been at our best when Lyndon Johnson could talk Everett Dirksen into supporting civil rights. You know the great story, he was trying to get Dirksen to help break the filibuster. And Johnson called him one day and said, "Everett, if you vote for this, for 100 years, American school children will only know 2 names, Abraham Lincoln and Everett McKinley Dirksen." Didn't quite work out like that, but it was a good call to make.
You mentioned immigration and the border, and we went down 2 weeks ago to Brownsville, Texas for the first time to have a look around. My wife and I doing some relief work through No Kid Hungry, which is a nonprofit that she's really active in. I'm not saying I changed on immigration, because I've always been fairly liberal toward that, but also worried about securing the borders, because if we don't secure the borders,
Sure.
we'll be overrun. But I was there, and we saw firsthand this administration's policies that are keeping people just across the border where these tent cities have sprung up.
Yeah.
These people have nothing. They come from Central America, but also all over the world. And we went one day and fed them. We went with a group and fed 600 people, and it was, you know, a remarkable experience. But they were telling stories. A lot of these young teenagers will come by themselves or without their parents, and we couldn't understand that. And we talked to one 13-year-old girl from Honduras who lived in a mountain village, and we asked her through an interpreter, you know, tell us your story. And she said that a gang moved in, and a gang member came to her home. She was kind of cute, kind of attractive little girl. And he said, told her parents, I'll be back tomorrow night to get her as my girlfriend. I'm going to take her off. And her parents were just horrified. And so in the middle of the night, she left home for America with a couple other teenagers from the village. And they made the trek through Honduras to Mexico to Brownsville. Took 5 weeks, and all kinds of horrible things happened along the way. And she found out later, the gang member went back the next day, she wasn't there, and he killed both of her parents.
Oh.
Those stories, that's why those people are there. They can't go home. It's not, these are not undocumented farm workers. These are people who show up in Brownsville and Laredo and McAllen and San Diego and Tucson at the border, and they surrender. And they say, we have nothing. We cannot go home. We can't. We have to flee. And usually we take them in. We give them. We detain them somewhere for a short period of time to feed them and all that kind of stuff to make sure they're safe. Then we started separating the children. Yeah. We started that policy. Since we stopped that policy, we have separated more than 900 children from their parents. We're still doing it. And so you've got these people who are. And then as of July, the administration said the border's sealed, those folks cannot come into America anymore. So if they can't come in, they're on the border at the bridge in Brownsville in tent cities and living in cheap tents and begging for food. And that's what we have caused as a nation. And it's very, very frustrating and heartbreaking. Yeah. So on that happy note, who's got a question? Anybody? Yes, ma'am, right here. Stand up and yell at me. You don't need a microphone. You don't need a microphone. Maybe you do need a microphone. Yell at me.
I was wondering, talk about all of these difficult interviews that you're able to procure. How are you able to procure these interviews with people that may not be willing to be interviewed, or there may be some red tape around it, especially as a beginner, when you were a beginner, when nobody knew your name?
So the question is, all of these interviews that I do, as I research the books, how am I able to get access to these people, wherever they go, wherever they, it's actually pretty easy. After
He tells them he's me.
I'll say, if you don't interview me, I'm going to send in my friend Jon Meacham to interview. It's, you know, nowadays it's pretty easy. I've rarely been turned down because I'm just honest up front. I say, look, I'm writing a book. I want to come visit Death Row in Oklahoma. I want to come visit the Hoover Building in Washington. And I did not get in, by the way. They turned me down. So I really screwed them in the book. I really took it. Prisons I've been to prisons all over the place. They're fairly easy to get into, but you just have to go through the proper channels. Be honest up front. Here's what I'm doing. I wrote a book called The Brethren, and I wanted to talk to some judges in prison. So I called the warden. I went through Washington, proper channels, and I called the warden. I said, do you have any judges locked up down there in Florida? He said, no, we don't have any judges. I said, do you have any lawyers? He said, oh, we always got a bunch of lawyers. And he did. And I went to the prison, and you know, they give you the royal treatment. And I interviewed all 5 lawyers. They brought them in, and we had these wonderful visits. And they said, sure, I did. I did this, I did that. One was the biggest drug lawyer in Miami. Did great stories. Every lawyer in prison has a great story. Oh, yeah. I don't write them because I don't want to get sued. They'll get out and sue me. So anyway, it's pretty easy to get interviews. I rarely get turned down. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Grab that mic right there.
Since it's right there.
Hello.
Oh, that's a great question. So talking about John's moment of insight and decision on the death penalty, in my work with President Bush, did I ever have a moment where my view changed of something? Almost all of them. And that's one of the joys of biography, particularly when you can actually talk to the person. My interviews with Madison are not as interesting. So that's a problem. But I did that book largely because I was an undergraduate when he was president, through most of it. And my best friend in college, as John knows, was a guy from Lynchburg, Tennessee named Jack Daniels. And so I was a little fuzzy on, I thought the Gulf War had to do with destiny. You know, I didn't know. And in 1990, so my view was very much that worst year of his political life. Bill Clinton, whom John has talked about so well, Clinton was redefining politics. You know, he's, I feel your pain. Remember when he went on Arsenio Hall and played the saxophone? Yeah. President Bush thought Arsenio Hall was a building at Yale. I mean, he had no idea. You know, I took Spanish there. He had no idea. So I kind of had this view of Bush as this kind of hapless wasp, right? He was Bertie Wooster. And then I met him. And this goes to the young woman's question. And he was immensely more complicated, immensely charming. He had a kind of quiet, persistent charisma. You saw it with the Heineken, right? And he was the kind, he had his big hands. He was left-handed and had always gestured with this. And I got this ineffable sense that, you know what? If you have to give the nuclear codes to somebody, you might as well give them to him. And what I wanted to do, that was Labor Day 1997 or 8. And almost from that moment, I wanted to try to explain what was it that would make a man be so captivating in person and yet project so poorly across the expanse of the Republic. And that was a question that I wanted to answer. And so spending all that time with him was essential in doing that. The other thing that, I don't have it with me, there's a letter I recommend to all of you that the president wrote in the late 1950s about the loss of their daughter, Robin. They lost a daughter to leukemia in 1953. And future President Bush wrote a letter to his mother in the late 50s about this. And a couple of the lines are, there is about our house a need. The running, pulsating restlessness of the boys needs a counterpart. We need some starched crisp frocks to go with all our torn-kneed blue jeans and helmets. We need some soft blonde curls to offset those crew cuts. We need a legitimate Christmas angel, one who doesn't have cuffs beneath the dress. We need someone to cry when I get mad, not argue. We need a little one who can kiss without leaving egg or jam or gum. We need a girl. We had one once. She'd fight and cry and play and make her way just like all the rest. But there was about her a certain softness. Her hugs were just a little less wiggly. My daddy had a caress, a certain ownership, which touched a slightly different spot than the hi dad I love so much. But she is still with us. We need her and yet we have her. We hope she'll stay in our house for a long, long time. Amazing letter. I had him read that out loud to me once in Houston. And long before he finished, he broke down with an extraordinary level of physical crying. I'd never seen anyone cry like that.
I'm breaking down now.
Yeah. And his chief of staff, a wonderful woman, came in and saw what we were doing. And she said to me, "Why did you want President Bush to read that?" And I said, well, if you want to know someone's heart, before I could finish, the president jumped in and said, you have to know what breaks it. That's the moment I knew that man.
I met Jeb later, not too many years ago, and we hung out a little bit, and I did not expect to really like him that much. I really like Jeb, and I wish Jeb had got the nomination in 2016. Yeah. We were talking politics, though, and it was in 1992 when Clinton beat his father, and he blamed it on the recession and other things. The way I remember it, Big Bush lost in 92 because of Ross Perot.
No.
Ross Perot jumped in, I thought, and got 20% of the vote.
He did. He got 19%. And this is one where political science helps. I dived inside those numbers. That's what the old man thought. It's what Jim Baker still thinks. It's what W thinks. That's interesting that Jeb didn't mention it. The problem was we had not had more than 8 years of one-party White House rule since Roosevelt and Truman. And before that, we hadn't had it since Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. So Bush was living on a kind of borrowed political time anyway for that 12 years. And honestly, think about George Herbert Walker Bush, his generation, and what happened in those 4 years as president. The Berlin Wall falls, the Soviet Union disintegrates on Christmas Day, 1991. The Gulf War is successful. It establishes a kind of new world standard after the Cold War. He didn't have much left to do. He was prepared. He eventually agreed with this. Mrs. Bush never did. He had done his duty. He left us in a world, when he became president, nuclear war was still a possibility. When he left, it was unthinkable. He passes NAFTA or gets it really close. He does the Americans with Disabilities Act. He stood up to Saddam, ends the Cold War. That's a pretty good to-do list, right? And he just wasn't all that interested. He was more interested than people thought, but fundamentally was not as interested in domestic policy, partly because he never had either house of Congress. I remember seeing him when Obama had the House, but not the Senate, I think, at one point. And Obama had just complained about that publicly. And I saw Bush that week. He said, I saw that, I wanted to say, try this on for size. Nobody likes you. So.
Okay.
Can I tell you? Can I tell my story?
Yeah, tell the story.
Okay. So.
The Andrew Jackson story?
Yeah.
Okay.
Here's the only story you're going to remember, except for Bush's. So you're going to think this is a joke, and it was one parachute and a rabbi, but I promise this is a true story. So this is about 3 of my favorite topics. It's about Donald Trump, Andrew Jackson, and George Herbert Walker Bush. Right? Sounds like a joke, but it's not. So in March of 2017, Trump announces that he's coming down to Tennessee, to Nashville, where I live, to lay a wreath at the grave of Andrew Jackson. And Steve Bannon, the late Steve Bannon, had decided that Trump was going to be Jackson. I think Trump thought he meant Michael, but anyway. So he thought he was going to Neverland, where are the llamas? Anyway, so he's coming down. And I'm sitting at home, and I think I should do something, right? I'm a Jackson biographer. I care about this stuff. So I wrote an open letter to the president saying, Dear Mr. President, welcome. Delighted you're embracing history. It's important to do. But if you're going to embrace Andrew Jackson, don't just embrace the crazy parts. And there are plenty of crazy parts of Andrew Jackson to embrace, right? He once said that his only two regrets in public life are that he had not hung Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, and shot John C. Calhoun, his own vice president. We now know that no one felt that way about their running mate until John McCain. But anyway, so Jackson was a unionist. He kept us together through a crisis with South Carolina, so I said, focus on that part of it. Anyway, it runs on the entire front page of the local paper. It had no effect on Donald Trump.
The Nashville, Tennessean.
Nashville, Tennessee. No effect on Donald Trump, whatever. The next day, true story, I'm walking into lunch and my phone rings, and it was George H.W. Bush. And the president had spent a lot of that winter in the hospital in Houston, and so his staff was printing stuff out for him to read, and they printed out this letter and given it to him. So he called up, he said, how you doing? said, I'm fine, Mr. President. How are you? He said, I'm fine. He said, I read your letter to Jackson. I thought, shit, the old boy's losing it, right? He thinks I'm writing letters to dead people. So I said, thank you, sir. I'm glad you're feeling better. Actually, sir, that was a letter to Trump about Jackson. And swear to God, without missing a beat, the old man said, yeah, but Jackson will pay more attention. True story. True story.
A great time to end, a great moment to end. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you, my friend.
He's going to speak.
Oh, okay. We're standing up for you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I didn't tell y'all, one of the reasons I came is because Grisham is a struggling young writer. So give him a chance. If you find a novel maybe of his, just give it a try.
Buy it. Always buy it.
Buy it, give it a try. You might like it.
Thank you both so much for an extraordinary evening. You've made us laugh, you've made us think, but you've also given us hope. So we really, really appreciate this tremendous opportunity. On behalf of all of us here at the university, I have a small token of our appreciation. I promise it is not each other's books.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, our Vision Series lineup is set for this year, and you can find it at jmu.edu/MVS. And next, on November 4th, we will host Rosemarie Zagari of George Mason University. Dr. Zagari will focus on the impact that women had on the founding of our nation, which is certainly an undertold story. That event will take place here again in Wilson Auditorium at 6 p.m. Again, that's on November 4th. Thank you all so much and have a great evening.
Thank you.